Disclaimer: this story is created purely for entertainment purposes. All characters and events are fictional. Viewer discretion is advised. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day when the house felt too still, almost as if it was holding its breath. The sunlight slipped through the curtains in golden streams, painting soft patterns across my room. I had finally stolen a moment for myself, away from the daily routine, thinking no one would interrupt. But sometimes life has its own plans, and it was on this very day that something happened I never expected, something that would leave me restless, confused, and wondering what to do next. My stepson and I had always shared a polite, respectful relationship. He was in his early 20s, independent, and usually kept to himself. We weren't extremely close, but there was always a sense of quiet understanding between us. I never thought much of it, just a normal, blended family dynamic. But little did I know that ordinary balance was about to change in a way I couldn't have imagined. That afternoon, I was in my room, lost in thought, when I sensed something unusual. At first, I brushed it off as the sound of the house settling or maybe the wind outside. But then, almost like a whisper at the back of my mind, I felt that someone's eyes were on me. It's strange how instinct works. You can just feel it when you're not alone, even if the room appears empty. I turned slightly, pretending not to notice, yet my heart started racing for reasons I couldn't explain. I tried to calm myself, convincing my mind that it was nothing. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a faint movement near the door. My breath hitched as I realized it wasn't shut all the way. The door had been left open just a crack, and behind that narrow gap, there was the faintest shadow. My pulse quickened as the truth sank in. Someone was standing there. I froze, torn between the instinct to call out and the fear of what I might discover if I did. The silence of the house suddenly felt heavy, pressing down on me. I leaned forward, straining to see without making it obvious. And then it hit me, the figure wasn't a stranger. It was him. My stepson. For a moment, I couldn't process it. Why was he there? Why hadn't he knocked? And most of all, why was he just standing there instead of saying something? A dozen questions raced through my head, but none of them had answers. All I knew was that he had peeked into my room, and in that split second, the fragile boundary of privacy I thought I had was gone. I wanted to believe it was an accident, that maybe he had come looking for something, or perhaps he hadn't realized the door wasn't fully closed. But deep inside, I wasn't sure. His eyes had locked with mine for the briefest moment before he quickly looked away, as if caught in a place he wasn't supposed to be. That single look carried a weight I couldn't ignore, a mixture of guilt, surprise, and something else I couldn't quite name. I sat there, pretending to stay calm, but inside, I was torn apart. Should I confront him? Should I act like nothing happened? If I brought it up, would it ruin the fragile peace of our household? But if I ignored it, could I ever shake the uneasy feeling that things were no longer the same? The rest of the house was still. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on my nightstand, each second stretching longer than the last. I wanted to call his name, but my voice seemed caught in my throat. All I could do was sit there, staring at that half-closed door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Finally, I heard the sound of soft footsteps retreating. He didn't close the door all the way, but the shadow was gone. My chest rose and fell as I tried to steady my breathing, though my mind was anything but steady. The image of his eyes meeting mine replayed over and over, leaving me unsettled. From that moment on, the room no longer felt like my own. The silence around me wasn't comforting anymore, it was loaded with questions, with the tension of an unspoken moment neither of us knew how to address. I tried to carry on with the rest of my day, but the memory lingered like a secret I couldn't shake. As evening approached, I found myself listening for every sound in the house. Was he avoiding me? Would he bring it up? Or would we both pretend nothing had happened, letting the moment slip into silence. I didn't know. All I knew was that things had changed. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The uncertainty gnawed at me, and no matter how many times I told myself to forget it, my heart refused to let go. I replayed every detail, the shadow, the crack in the door, the look in his eyes. Each time, it felt heavier, as though the air between us had shifted into something I couldn't name. The question burned inside me, was it a mistake, or was there something more behind that glance? And if there was, did I even want to know? I turned over, staring into the darkness, knowing that tomorrow would come, and with it, the impossible choice of whether to speak up or keep this secret buried. One thing was certain, after that day, nothing would ever feel the same again. And as I closed my eyes, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, though I hadn't really slept much through the night. My mind kept replaying the moment over and over, the way the door was left just slightly open, the faint shadow, and the look in his eyes when our gazes met. Even now, as sunlight filled the room, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. It was as though the entire house had been painted in a new light, one that felt heavier and unfamiliar. I went about my routine, making coffee and trying to act normal, but inside I was anything but. I kept listening for his footsteps, wondering if he'd come into the kitchen, if we'd have to face each other, or if he would avoid me altogether. When he finally did come down the stairs, his face looked calm, maybe even too calm, as if he'd rehearsed it. He greeted me with a casual morning, as though nothing had happened. I smiled back, though it felt forced, my heart pounding against my ribs. We sat across from each other at the table, the quiet between us stretching uncomfortably. I wanted to say something, ask why he was at my door, why he hadn't knocked, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. Instead, I sipped my coffee and pretended to be interested in the sunlight spilling across the window. As we sat there, I thought back to the day he had first moved into the house. He was polite, reserved, and carried himself with a quiet maturity that surprised me for his age. At the time, I had felt relieved. Blended families could be complicated, but with him, things had seemed easier than I expected. There was always a sense of respect in the way he spoke to me, even if we weren't close. That's why last night had shaken me so deeply, it didn't fit the picture I had built of him in my mind. Later in the day, I tried to distract myself with chores, but every little sound made me wonder where he was. If he passed through the hallway, I found myself tensing, pretending to be focused on what I was doing so I wouldn't have to meet his eyes. I kept telling myself it was probably a mistake, that maybe he hadn't realized the door was open, but deep down, I couldn't dismiss the look I saw. It wasn't nothing. By the afternoon, I caught myself watching him from a distance, searching for clues in the way he carried himself. Did he look uncomfortable? Did he avoid eye contact on purpose? But no matter how much I observed, he gave nothing away. He went about his day as if everything was perfectly normal. And maybe that was what unsettled me the most, how easily he acted like nothing had happened, while I was left carrying the weight of it. That evening, we ended up in the living room at the same time. He sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, while I pretended to be interested in a book I wasn't actually reading. The silence was unbearable, and I finally forced myself to break it. "You seemed quiet today," I said lightly, though my voice betrayed a nervous edge. He looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Just tired," he replied, before returning his attention to the screen. That was all. Nothing more. It should have been enough to calm me, but instead, it only deepened the unease. When I went upstairs later, I paused at my bedroom door, staring at it for a long moment before finally closing it fully, making sure the latch clicked into place. For the first time, I realized how much I had taken that small sense of privacy for granted. Now, I wasn't sure I could relax in my own room again. As I lay in bed, I thought back to earlier times, to the small moments that maybe I hadn't noticed before. A lingering glance across the kitchen. The way he sometimes seemed to pause before answering me. Had I missed signs that should have warned me? Or was I simply reading too much into something that was nothing more than a misunderstanding? The questions swirled in my head with no answers, only adding to the storm of confusion building inside me. Days passed, and though nothing outwardly happened, the tension didn't fade. If anything, it grew. The more we avoided the subject, the heavier it felt. Every casual conversation was laced with unspoken questions. Every time I caught him passing in the hallway, I felt my breath catch, wondering if he was thinking about that night too. One evening, I found myself standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the fading sunset, when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn right away, but I knew it was him. The air shifted when he was near, and I felt it instantly. He walked past me quietly, pouring himself a glass of water. For a moment, it felt like any other evening. But then, as he turned to leave, his eyes met mine again. Just for a second. And in that second, I saw it, the same unspoken tension, the same weight that had been haunting me since that night. My heart raced, and I wanted to speak, to finally ask him what he had been doing at my door, but before I could gather the courage, he walked away. I was left standing there, staring at the empty space he left behind, my mind spinning. I knew I couldn't go on like this forever, pretending the moment hadn't happened. But I also knew that once I brought it up, nothing would ever be the same again. The fragile balance of our lives would shatter, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. So I stayed silent, even as the questions inside me grew louder with each passing day. And yet, deep down, I knew this was far from over. The look in his eyes had told me that much. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I could feel it every time we crossed paths. The story wasn't finished, it had only just begun. The following week felt like walking on a tightrope, every step measured, every word weighed. I told myself that time would ease the tension, that the uncomfortable memory of that night would fade into the background. But instead, it seemed to grow stronger, quietly weaving itself into every part of my daily life. I began noticing small things I had never paid attention to before. The way his footsteps seemed to pause outside my door at night before continuing down the hall. The way his eyes sometimes lingered a little too long when we crossed paths in the kitchen. Or how he would suddenly change the subject if our conversations veered too close to personal topics. Maybe I was imagining it, maybe it was all in my head, but the more I tried to dismiss it, the harder it became to ignore. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the living room, I overheard him talking on the phone in the next room. His voice was low, serious, and though I couldn't make out every word, I caught enough to feel unsettled. He said something about not being able to explain everything yet, and it's complicated. My heart raced as I strained to listen, wondering who he was speaking to and if it had anything to do with me. By the time he hung up, I had more questions than answers, and a new layer of unease settled over me. Later that night, I found myself replaying the phone call in my head. Was it about me? Or was I letting paranoia get the better of me? I wanted so badly to ask him, but I couldn't bring myself to cross that line. Instead, I carried the weight of silence, hoping somehow the truth would reveal itself without me having to shatter the fragile balance we had left. Meanwhile, life outside the house carried on. Friends called to check in, neighbors waved from across the street, and from the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. But inside, the quiet tension grew like an invisible storm. I couldn't even confide in anyone, not without sounding irrational or risking that someone might misunderstand. So I kept everything locked inside, smiling when I had to, pretending nothing was wrong. One evening, I decided to test the waters. While we were both in the kitchen, I casually mentioned, "I heard you on the phone earlier." Sounded serious. He froze for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to notice, before replying lightly, "Oh, just a friend. Nothing important." His answer was simple, but his eyes told a different story. I let it go, though the knot in my stomach only grew tighter. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about that night at the door anymore. It was about everything that had come after, the glances, the silence, the unanswered questions. I started wondering if maybe he was struggling with something he couldn't share, something unrelated but heavy enough to spill into our interactions. That thought scared me almost as much as the alternative. At the same time, another subplot began to unfold. A family gathering was coming up, one that would bring everyone under the same roof. The idea of being around so many people while carrying this secret made my chest tighten. I worried about how I would act, how I would hide the unease without someone noticing. I couldn't risk anyone asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. The days leading up to the gathering felt endless. Every interaction with him seemed loaded, like we were both silently circling around the same unspoken truth. One night, as I was setting the table for dinner, he walked in and offered to help. Our hands brushed briefly as we reached for the same plate, and I felt a jolt run through me, one I quickly tried to hide. He didn't say anything, but his eyes flickered with something I couldn't name before he looked away. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, the house quiet around me. The tension was becoming unbearable, and I knew we couldn't keep living like this. Yet, every time I thought about confronting him, fear stopped me cold. What if I was wrong? What if I misread everything and risked destroying the fragile piece of our family? But what if I was right? The uncertainty was its own kind of torment. The conflict deepened as I realized I was no longer just questioning his actions, I was questioning myself. Was I being too cautious? Too fearful? Or was I protecting something that needed to stay hidden until the right moment? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving me restless and uncertain. And as the family gathering drew closer, I knew one thing for sure, the uneasy silence between us couldn't last much longer. Something was bound to break, and when it did, nothing in our lives would ever be the same again. The night before the family gathering, I could barely sleep. My thoughts were tangled, and every sound in the house seemed louder than usual. I kept replaying the look in his eyes, the shadow at my door, the way he had brushed off my question about the phone call. Each memory felt sharper in the dark, as though the silence of the night gave them new power. By morning, I felt restless, uneasy, almost as if something was bound to happen. I went about the day as if everything was normal, preparing for the gathering, making sure the house looked ready. But underneath the surface, my nerves were stretched tight. I could feel him moving around the house, his presence as heavy as ever, though neither of us spoke more than a few polite words. When the guests began to arrive, I forced a smile and welcomed everyone warmly. Laughter and conversation soon filled the rooms, but even with the noise around me, I couldn't shake the tension. Every time I caught a glimpse of him across the room, my heart skipped. He acted calm, chatting casually, blending in as though nothing was wrong. But I knew. I could feel it, something was simmering just below the surface. As the evening went on, I noticed him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. Our eyes met more than once, each time for just a second too long. It left me unsettled, my chest tightening with questions I couldn't ask in front of everyone else. I tried to focus on the conversations around me, but the weight of his gaze kept pulling me back. Later, when most of the guests had moved to the living room, I stepped away to catch my breath in the quiet hallway. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm inside me. But then I sensed it, that same familiar feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. Neither of us spoke at first. The air between us was charged, heavy with everything unspoken. My pulse raced as I searched his face for answers, but all I saw was the same unreadable expression, hiding more than it revealed. Finally, he took a small step closer, his voice low, almost hesitant. "We can't keep avoiding this," he said. My breath caught, my thoughts scattering. I wanted to respond, to ask what exactly he meant, but the words refused to form. The sound of laughter drifted from the other room, a stark contrast to the tension in the hallway. I felt trapped between two worlds, the normal, cheerful life everyone else saw, and the secret, fragile truth that only we carried. In that moment, I knew we were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. And yet, the answer to what would happen next still hung just out of reach. "Do you want me to write the climax next, around 700 to 800 words, so it flows seamlessly from this point?" I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart racing so fast I could hear it in my ears. His words, "We can't keep avoiding this," kept echoing in my mind, but before I could respond, footsteps sounded nearby. We both instinctively stepped back, forcing neutral expressions as one of the relatives passed by with a cheerful smile, completely unaware of the tension crackling between us. Once the hallway was empty again, I expected him to continue, but instead, he looked down, his jaw tight, as if he was struggling with something heavier than I realized. Then came the twist I hadn't seen coming. "There's more you don't know," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me shiver. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but he cut me off softly. "It wasn't the first time." The words sank in slowly, each one striking like a blow. My chest tightened as I tried to process what he had just admitted. Not the first time? My mind scrambled through memories, wondering how many times I had been completely unaware, how many moments had slipped past me while I thought I was alone. Suddenly, the small things I had dismissed, the pauses outside my door, the lingering glances, the tension in the air, didn't feel so small anymore. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the sound of voices from the living room reminded me we weren't alone. He seemed to notice my hesitation, his eyes flicking toward the direction of the laughter before returning to me. "After tonight," he whispered, "we need to talk. No more pretending." The ground beneath me felt unsteady. The stakes had shifted, and whatever I thought I knew was only the surface of something much deeper. And as I returned to the gathering, trying to smile and carry on, I knew the real storm was only just beginning. "Would you like me to carry this directly into the climax chapter, around 800 words, so the tension peaks naturally?" When the last of the guests finally left, the house grew quiet again. My heart pounded as I realized the moment he had warned me about was here. I turned to find him already waiting in the hallway, his expression serious but calm. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was louder than any words. Finally, I broke it. "What did you mean earlier, when you said it wasn't the first time?" My voice trembled despite my effort to sound steady. He took a breath, his gaze steady on mine. "I've noticed things for a while," he admitted softly. "I didn't mean to cross a line, but I couldn't pretend I didn't care anymore." The weight of his words sank into me, and I realized the tension between us hadn't just been my imagination. All those lingering glances, the quiet pauses, they weren't coincidences. He had been carrying the same unspoken feelings I had been too afraid to name. I felt torn, caught between relief at finally having the truth and fear of what it meant. Before I could respond, he stepped back, giving me space. "I just needed you to know," he said quietly. "After tonight, nothing has to change, unless you want it to." His words left me breathless. The choice was suddenly in my hands, and the weight of it pressed down on me. I thought the story had reached its peak, but then, as I turned toward my room, I noticed the door wasn't fully shut. A shadow slipped away down the hall, someone had been there, watching. In that instant, I realized the story wasn't ending here. Someone else knew. And everything was about to change again. Do you want me to draft the final epilogue, around 400 to 500 words, to wrap this YouTube story in a powerful, memorable way? I froze when I saw the shadow disappear down the hallway. For a moment, fear gripped me. Had someone overheard everything? The thought of another person knowing made my chest tighten, but as I stepped into the hall, I realized it was just my sister, leaving quietly after helping clean up from the gathering. She smiled faintly when she noticed me and said, "I didn't want to bother you, you both looked like you were having a serious talk." Relief washed over me, though the tension lingered. Later that night, I sat alone in my room, replaying every moment in my mind. My stepson had been honest, more than I expected, and I finally understood the weight he had been carrying. The unanswered questions, the strange silences, the careful glances, they all made sense now. I knew I had a choice, to either bury the truth and pretend it never happened, or to face it and set clear boundaries for the sake of our family. In the end, I chose honesty, not just with him but with myself. The next morning, we sat down and spoke openly. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. We agreed to move forward with respect, keeping our trust intact without crossing lines that could harm the balance of our lives. Looking back, I realized the experience taught me the importance of communication and awareness in blended families. Secrets create distance, but honesty builds understanding. And though the tension had tested us, it ultimately brought clarity and a new sense of peace to our home.